Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining this webinar today on doing more with bike data. My name is Amelia Neptune. I'm with the League of American Bicyclists, and we are really happy to host this webinar today, partnering with EcoCounter to bring great information to you all about bike data collection in bicycle-friendly communities around the country. So I'm going to start out with just a few logistical details, and then I'll pass it over to our friends at EcoCounter. This webinar is being recorded, and tomorrow everyone who registered for the webinar will receive an email with the recording. So rest assured, if you want to watch it again, or if you missed some part of it, or if you want to share with colleagues, you'll be able to do that. There is a question text box on your screen. Feel free to type in questions at any point during the webinar. We've provided a bunch of time at the end to answer all of those questions. Attendees are all muted, so you will have to type them in, but I'll be moderating those questions at the end. So feel free to type them in at any time, and we'll get to them at the very end of the session. The speakers will take turns muting and unmuting themselves, but like I said, attendees are all muted. So if you need any help, technical difficulties, feel free to type into the chat box and we'll do our best to take care of you. All right, with that, I'm going to hand it over to Matt Ainsley from EcoCounter and let him introduce this session and the speakers.
Thank you very much, Amelia. Welcome everybody to today's webinar, Doing More with Bike Data. My name is Matt Ainsley and I work as the market strategist at EcoCounter. In my role as the market strategist at EcoCounter, it revolves around ensuring that organizations have the right tools that they need to collect and apply bike and pedestrian count data. And this webinar series is very much part of that process. We've been a proud partner of the League of American Bicyclists for many years now and have been running this webinar series for, I think it's 3 years in a row now. The goal of which is really just to share some best practices and give a wide audience the chance to hear some case studies and hear some stories about how bike data is used on a day-to-day basis to work towards more bike-friendly communities and a more bike-friendly planet. So we have 4 presenters with us today. We'll start off by hearing from Braden, who is the assistant planner at the Community Planning Association of Southwest Idaho, also known as COMPAS. Following that, you'll hear from Katie Lang, who is the Director of Active Transportation at Bike Arlington and Walk Arlington. After that, you'll hear from my colleague, David Bytel, who is the Data Services Specialist at EcoCounter. After that, you'll hear from Matt Starkey, who is the Transportation Engineer for Presidio Trust. And last but not least, you'll hear once again from Amelia Neptune, who introduced the session. Amelia is the Director of the Bicycle Friendly America program from the League of American Bicyclists. And Amelia will share with you a couple of updates from the League and a couple of things, exciting things that are happening at the League right now. After that, we'll then move on to the question period. And as Amelia mentioned, you can put those questions in the chat and we'll get to as many as we can after the session. So just really briefly, if I can introduce who is EcoCounter for those of you who don't know. So we are a company that specializes in bike and pedestrian counting equipment in rural and urban environments. So we have 20 years of experience and are trusted on the busiest bike lanes in North America, all the way to the most rural rail trails, to hiking trails in the Rockies, all over the map. And we do that by manufacturing our own bike and pedestrian counters. We do that in-house through our own research and development and our own manufacturing facility. That includes both permanent and temporary counters. So the kind of bike counters that you could install in the ground and have counts 24/7 permanently, or also type of counters that you can easily move around, allowing for those short-term counts, 2-week counts, before and after impact of infrastructure, things like that. And all of our counters are durable and discreet. They blend into the natural and urban environments. Something I really just take a lot of joy in really is like riding from home to the EcoCounter office and not think about the number of times that I get counted on a morning, like without even noticing it. Often you don't know you're being counted because the counter's there on your favorite bike lane, collecting that data for the city or for partner organizations. And so we also work with organizations to help them develop their count programs. And what that means is that we help organizations we help them develop their count programs, and most of all, we help them get the most out of their data. It's in that sense that we enable a data-driven approach to bike planning and bike infrastructure management. You're going to hear some really great case studies today about applying bike data and using bike data, and how our speakers use bike data to help them get more out of their everyday work and work towards advancing their bike-friendly community. We know, and we've talked about many times in our webinars before, that collecting bike count data helps in the bike-friendly community certification process. A couple of years ago, we looked into the different levels, so the gold, silver, platinum levels, and found that of the BFC gold cities, more than half of them collect bike count data, and of the BFC platinum cities, all of the BFC platinum cities collect bike count data and use that in their application process. So that's enough from me. For now, I'm going to turn it over to our first speaker, who is Braden Cervetti. As I mentioned, Braden is the assistant planner at the Community Planning Association of Southwest Idaho, also known as COMPAS. And with that, Braden, I'll pass it over to you.
All right, thank you very much, Matt. One moment to get set up. All right, fantastic. Well, thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be here with you all today. My notes and my presentation are off to the right here, so you still have my attention, even though I'm not looking at the camera. But my name is Braden Cervetti, as Matt had mentioned, and I am the bicycle and pedestrian planner at COMPAS, which is in Southwest Idaho. And today I'm going to talk to you about the COMPAS Counter Program, and we'll follow that up with some of the ways that we use that data, and then I will wrap up with some tips for those of you who might be looking at introducing your own counter program, or maybe introducing some improvements to your own counter program now. So to start off, adjustment there. So COMPAS, the organization that I work for, is a metropolitan planning organization, and it functions within Ada and Canyon County in Idaho, which is otherwise known as the Treasure Valley. And we're a forum for regional transportation planning collaboration between municipalities and highway districts and other transportation stakeholders. And like many areas, the Treasure Valley is experiencing substantial growth. And it's our job at COMPAS to develop the long-range transportation plan, which explores how this area can accommodate this growth while balancing quality of life. And one facet of that long-range transportation plan is active transportation, cycling and pedestrians. But naturally, cycling is a big part of the Treasure Valley's culture, whether it's transportation or recreation. It's hugely popular out here, and as the valley grows, so does our need for accommodations in our transportation system. One way that COMPAS addressed this growing need was through the adoption of our Bicycle and Pedestrian Counter Program. This program functions on behalf of our member agencies to provide them with bike and pedestrian data to help influence their planning decisions. And our counter program actually kicked off in 2015. It's been half a decade since we started that off. But in that time, we've gathered quite a bit of data and learned some interesting lessons along the way that I'm excited to share with you all today. But first, I just want to talk a little bit more about our counter program. For broad stroke purposes, our program is two-tiered. We have the permanent counters, and then we have what we call portable counters. Each type of counter is very similar in the way they function. But the way they're used and the data that they generate can be surprisingly different at times. So first, the permanent counters. Matt spoke about these a little bit, but when we first had these counters installed, they were the first of their kind in Idaho. We currently have 14 that are installed across the Treasure Valley, indicated by the little eco counter signs there. But all of our permanent counters have been provided by EcoCounter. We are working with them to create our network of counters, and they're located on separated pathways that specifically serve cyclists and pedestrians. And this photo here is showing one of those counters. It's located in Garden City, Idaho. And these types of counters are capable of differentiating between pedestrians and cyclists, as well as directional travel, which way the pathway user is going. And one of the most useful things about these counters is that they're gathering data 24/7, 365. And it also will automatically transmit that data to a web portal. So they remain installed at their given location permanently, hence our pseudonym permanent counter. But they're a little more expensive than their portable counterpart in our program and require a little more effort with that installation. But the amount of data that they're producing is significantly greater. And next is the portable counters. Compass utilizes a number of different brands and types of portable counters for our program, and each type of portable counter serves a different need. So, for example, one style of counter would be better suited for gathering counts on a single track mountain bike trail, while another type of counter would be better suited for gathering data on a shared roadway. So by contrast to the permanent counters, these counters are typically installed for 2 weeks at a time and then are retrieved from the field and the data is processed manually back at the office. The true utility of these types of counters for us is that they can be installed in multiple locations, and they also tend to have a much lower price tag than the permanent counters. But the data you end up with is a little bit less robust. In this past half decade since we started our counter program, Compass has deployed hundreds of these portable counter installations. So how is this data actually used? With this program, we've managed to generate a lot of data, but how are we using it? And I think first off, it's really important to note that there are other organizations in the Treasure Valley that have made long-standing efforts toward gathering cyclist and pedestrian data. It includes the Treasure Valley Cycling Alliance and multiple municipalities. And it helps that it seems that there's to be this unified vision and value of this type of data in our planning area. But as the amount of data continues to grow, so do the opportunities for us to utilize this data in our planning process. So one way that our data is frequently used is in before and after counts. So for example, there was an instance in the Treasure Valley just recently where a pivotal bridge was subject to huge damage due to flooding and was subsequently removed for a couple of years to ensure that the bridge was safe to use and it wasn't going to get washed downstream. And actually, here are a couple of photos of it. This was problematic because the bridge was a critical connector for the over the Boise River for cyclists and pedestrians. But eventually, through a number of coordinated efforts, the riverbank was secured and the bridge was reinstalled. And fortunately for us, we had a nearby permanent counter that had been installed and gathering traffic volume data before and after. And this numerical data can show local decision makers that characteristics such as connectivity bolster usership and can incentivize it for the future. Really, it was just so impressive to see the volume of users spike so dramatically when that connection was reestablished, and it just shows how important it is for those past users. Next is what I refer to as cyclical counts. I don't know if it's a bicycle pun or what, but this is where the permanent counters really begin to shine for us. Using them, we can compare annual data and start to see growth trends. As with many places, the amount of traffic that our pathways saw increased dramatically with the introduction of COVID in the beginning of this year. But instead of relying on platitudes such as quote unquote dramatic growth, we could identify specific growth patterns in specific regions of our network. This type of annual analysis could be used to estimate growth patterns for our future and for our networks. And it should be noted, however, that certain events that could spike traffic volume on your networks, like 5K runs and pandemics apparently, can skew this data, and it should be keenly reviewed for anomalies or abnormalities before heavily relying on it. And finally, one of the most powerful things that I feel like our data can do is offer new perspective for local decision makers. A lot of the times as a practitioner, it's easy to get lost in the numbers and the work can become somewhat abstract in our minds. But sometimes at the end of the day, it can really be as simple as taking something that's qualitative, like a feeling or a belief about a physical place or transportation system, and turning it into something that is more tangible. Raw data is something that can really help decision makers feel confident in the choices that they make, and this data is a great way to meet that need for them. So as I conclude here, I just want to leave you with 3 tips that I wish I had been given when I was starting up at my position at Compass. Some of them may seem a little bit obvious, but I still think they're worth hitting on. So number 1, know your equipment. There are there's a number of brands and styles of counters out there, and each one of them functions differently. I know EcoCounter has informative documentation for each of their units, as well as a helpful group of professionals that are ready to help field user questions, but study up before installing anything. This will save you a ton of time and really money in the long run. I have broken counters in the past by leaving them installed for too long in bad weather and not being prepared to maintain them in the way that they should be, which this could have been avoided if I dedicated more time to understanding my equipment. It's a terrible feeling breaking a counter, and I'd love to help keep it from you if I can. Number 2, after you understand what you're working with, you need to do the legwork on where you're installing. You need to know your site. Each installation site has very unique characteristics, even if it doesn't really seem that way. When you start to look at it and dig in, it becomes a little bit more apparent. Who are the users of the site? Is it a shared roadway? Is it a pathway? Is it subject to flooding? If it is, you might end up with your pants rolled up to your knees while uninstalling a soggy counter, which is something that I've done. Could it be prone to vandalism? We once had a counter that was installed near a field hockey court, and a group of kids used their field hockey sticks on our pole-mounted camera, or our counter rather, as a piñata. Very interesting things. Is your site close to a forest or wooded area? If so, insects could find the interior of that counter to be suitable nesting area. You could end up being stuck removing hundreds of nasty spider nests from the inside of a counter. I didn't include a photo for this, but I do have it, and I promise it's unpleasant. The more you contemplate these things, the more prepared you'll be, which leads me nicely into my 3rd and final tip, which would be prepare, prepare, prepare. For example, with permanent counters, be prepared for things like battery replacements. Nothing hurts more than having a huge hole of missing data from your annual counts because you didn't order something simple like a new battery in time. And for portable counters, you need to have a system. Installations always require a host of additional items to properly secure the installation, like locks or straps or tools. These are all critical for making sure things go off without a hitch. And one of the easiest ways to start to waste time and resources is to fly by the seat of your pants. So my advice is to prepare a checklist that is mandatory for review each time before leaving the office and going into the field. I know how simple it sounds, but after countless returns to the office from the field because I've forgotten a key or a very basic critical tool, I can tell you that it is a huge time saver, and you will thank me in the future. With that, I guess I just want to say thank you all for the opportunity to speak, and I look forward to learning alongside you. So thanks again.
Thank you very much, Braden, for sharing your perspective today. It's really interesting to hear sort of like what you and your team use counts for 5 years into the program. And you know, we can think of many reasons why you'd want to start a count program, and it's interesting to see some overlap between a count program that is just beginning, that is maybe capturing baseline trends and capturing cyclical counts, or justifying investments, and those are as true 5 years into a program as they are right at the beginning. So really appreciate your perspective, and it's nice to hear something that's applicable to someone with a really developed bike count program, and also someone who might just be starting out with their first count or something like that. So thanks very much for sharing your perspective.
Absolutely.
So up next, we have Katie Lang. Katie is the Director of Active Transportation for Bike Arlington and for Walk Arlington also. And I'll pass it over to you, Katie. And just for the moment, I only see about half of your presentation. It's just cut off to the left on my screen.
That's not good.
So
Let's try again.
okay, I can see it all. I can see it all now in your PowerPoint mode.
How about
And
now?
it's cut off once again. It's almost like in portrait mode.
That's very odd.
How about one more?
Yeah.
And worst case scenario, we can always take a look at the presentation in PowerPoint mode. Still
This
the
is
same.
Amelia. I can also share her slides from my screen if that's easier. I can pull them up in just a moment.
Yeah, maybe that's better. Sorry about that. I don't know
Okay.
what's going on.
I'll switch over to me and you guys can start talking and I'll try to get your slides up ASAP.
Okay. So hi everyone, sorry about the technical difficulty. My name is Katie Lang. I'm the program director for active transportation in Arlington County. I manage our Bike Arlington and our Walk Arlington programs. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how our programs use our bike and ped counter data to adjust what we do with our programming and to make sure that we're serving everyone in Arlington. And then I have two brief case studies for our work. So while Amelia is getting up the rest of my presentation, there we go. You can go to the next, the slide 2, Amelia, please. A little bit about us. Bike Arlington and Walk Arlington are the active transportation demand management groups in Arlington, Virginia. So we don't do any bike lane installation or, capital P planning, but we serve Arlington residents and help people bike and walk around Arlington. Our mission being to get more people biking and walking more of the time. And through our suite of programs, as well as a number of other programs that Arlington has, we remove about 40,000 car trips from the roads every day. And Arlington County, for those of you who haven't been to Arlington, we're right outside DC. You can see the Washington Monument in this picture here. Pretty tiny, only 26 square miles, but we have an extremely robust trail system, which I'll talk about in a little bit. Next slide, please. Can you go to the next slide? Thank you. So we have 37 permanent counters, and I have to thank Braden for giving a good overview of what those counters are like. We have 37 of them across the county, and those are maintained by our Department of Environmental Services. So I have to give a shout out to them as well for installing and maintaining the counters. And we have 6 portable counters. And our permanent counters are installed all over the county on our trail system, and also split about 50-50 with our bike lanes. Next slide, please. We also have the East Coast's first bikeometer. It's our permanent bike counter located on the Custis Trail, which again, if you've been into Arlington, it's the bridge that goes, it's very close to the bridge that goes over the Potomac River into Georgetown, into Washington, DC. And again, first of its kind on the East Coast, people love to look at it. It sees about 400,000 trips per year. Next slide, please. So before I go into our case studies, I just wanted to give some quick counter takeaways that we like to talk about in Arlington when we're talking about our counter program. We've had this program for about a decade now, and so we have a really good, robust data set. Oh, sorry, one slide back. We have a really robust data set to draw from for what our counter program can tell us. One point is that we have about 500,000 bicycle trips on some of our most popular trails per year. Some of our sites around metro rail stations, our commuter subway system, if you will, see about 1,000 pedestrians per hour outside of those stations during the peak. So a lot of foot traffic, a lot of bike traffic. We also can clearly see from our data, and I'll show that on the next slide, that there's a clear pattern of activities and a variety of different activities on our trails. One thing that's really cool is you can see these big spikes in the 9 to 5 kind of commute pattern, but you also see a lot of weekend, what we would call like recreational activity, which is a more gentle curve of weekend activity. And that's analyzed over many, many years and allows us to actually show that there's demand for this type of transportation and that there's a clear pattern of this type of transportation in Arlington. Those seasonal profiles can also allow us to kind of expand what we know in the short term to what we might assume in the long term, even for sites where we don't have counters. And that's more of the work that our planning department does, but they're able to use that data to do that. So the next slide, just really briefly, wanted to illustrate those commute peaks that you see. This is 7 years of continuous counts. The vertical axis is the counts and the horizontal axis is time of day. So you very, very clearly see that, I think this is on the Custis Trail, you see that 9 to 5 commute pattern very, very clearly. Next, please. All right, so how do our Bike Arlington programs in particular use this counter data? I wanted to give 2 case studies or 2 examples of that. And the first is Safe Track. Now, this was a period of intensive track work on our Metro rail system, which spans, DC, Arlington, and the surrounding region, and meant station shutdowns, entire lines being shut down, dramatic reduction in service. And so you can imagine kind of the transportation world at that time in 2016 was wondering, well, how is this going to impact us? Are people going to start driving en masse? Are they going to abandon Metro rail? Are they going to switch to bus? Kind of, is there going to be just gridlock? What's going to happen? So if you can actually skip 2 slides, please. So we were able to show that what has actually happened, waiting for that slide to come up. Thank you. So the story that the counter data actually told us is that people did switch to biking during Safe Track work. Very exciting finding for us. We knew it was happening anecdotally, and we had hoped it would happen. But as you can see from this chart here, the chart on the previous slide, it shows the percent increase in the bike traffic on a typical week. So we're still on the previous slide, sorry. My darn computer messed it all up, not showing you all the slides. Sorry, Amelia, the previous slide with the chart. Can you go back? You're going forward, I'm sorry. Skipping ahead. One more. Thank you so much. So this chart shows the percent increase in the workday average during that Safe Track period from the previous time period. That's okay. The previous time period.
Katie?
I can.
Sorry, I think there's a really long lag between when I hear you.
No worries. No worries. So the story is that people were taking to the trails during Safe Track up to 80% higher than the previous year average. That's all of those little vertical columns there are just showing the different eco-counter sites that we have, the counter sites. And then as you can see, the 1 week during Surge 1, which just tells us which phase of the track work was happening, over 80% higher than the previous year. So if you go to the next slide, please, the this is kind of how our programs adjusted. So what did we do with that data once we knew it was happening? Well, we found clearly that people are willing and able to shift their transportation in response to constraints in the system. And what's really cool about Arlington is we have a number of trails that almost perfectly parallel the Metro Rail routes. That would be the Custis Trail in North Arlington, paralleling I-66, and the Mount Vernon Trail going down into South Arlington and Alexandria that parallels the George Washington Parkway and the blue and yellow line on Metro. So we did a couple of things. We started bike trains at the Metro stations, and those were to help support people who were just getting started biking and maybe were a little nervous about how they would actually get from one of the far out Metro rail stations into downtown. We featured stories of people who had done just that to kind of humanize this shift and make it clear to our audiences that people were doing this. Regular people were switching to bike commuting. And then sharing the data. Understandably, around the region, transportation professionals were wondering what the impact would be, and because we already had a robust counter system in place, we were able to, as Braden had stated, see the before and after. So next slide, or you can actually skip to the one after that. Oh, sorry, so that was just an example of some of the things that we did. You can see the picture on the bottom of the orange and silver line. Ask Us About Bike Commuting was a pretty cool installation that we did. So sorry, now Amelia, you can skip 2 slides. I'll talk a little bit about this year and COVID-19. The story from the counter data during the pandemic, trail use way up. This chart shows that in March and like a weekend in late March, that traffic on 3 of our local trails was up 50 to 243%. So just seeing incredible increases in trail traffic. And that's the red bars there. That's this year, 2020. And the blue columns are the previous 3-year average. So we wanted to make sure like weather and all of that didn't influence. So took the last 3 years, still seeing these really big jumps in trail traffic. So next slide is, what did we do with this information? Our programs, as you know, we help educate, inform, and encourage people to get out there and bike and walk. So what do you do when trail crowding is becoming a problem? And back in March and April, we didn't understand a lot about this pandemic, and we still don't, but people were very concerned about getting too close to other people. And anecdotally, we knew that people are finding the trails to be overcrowded, but we also had the data to show that. So we did a couple of things. We adjusted our messages to encourage people to use the trails at non-peak times. We were still seeing, especially on weekends, a huge portion of trail use happening in the afternoon. And in fact, some of our counters were seeing like 600 plus ped bike counts in the afternoon, like per hour in the afternoons, which is just a phenomenal amount of people on one trail. So we did adjust our messaging to let people know that there were other times that they could use the trail. We also developed a completely new non-trail based resource. We have maps. We have great low stress maps of Arlington bike routes, but we thought let's actually pull together some of these resources into places where people can go and encourage them that they can have a nice ride. They can ride with their kids, ride for exercise that doesn't involve the trails at all, to kind of shift the demand from off the trail network onto our streets. We also highlighted neighborhood walks through our Walk Arlington program and did short videos. Some residents sent us some great videos of where they like to walk in their own neighborhood to, again, highlight that people can have a great, safe, comfortable, enjoyable walking experience right where they live. And then lastly, we created some safe walking tips and infographics to share. So on the next slide, you can see some examples of that. Just have some screenshots of the resources. On the very bottom, there's a link if you wanted to go check out our low stress routes resource that we created. And then finally, I would be remiss if I didn't talk about how our data is open. So we have a publicly available portal. Any of you, all of you, can go on right now. I think if you just Google Bike Arlington counters, this website will come up. It's an easy to use dashboard. It lets you filter by bike, ped, time of day, day of week, and particular trails that you're looking for. So this gets great use across the region, but also nationally for people who are doing research and they want to know about trends and kind of use our data set to do that. So that's another way that we use the program to help biking and walking in Arlington and beyond. So that concludes. I think the last slide just has my contact information. If anyone has any questions, feel free to reach out to us. And thank you, Amelia, for the slides.
And thank you, Katie, for your presentation and for helping out on today's webinar. I think it's really interesting to talk about those two spikes around COVID and the boom we see around COVID, but then also around like replacing some of those transit trips with cycling. You know, there's so much talked about how do you sustain those kind of things? How do you get people who are switching to those modes to stick with it? And it's really great to see you and your organization like doing the work behind that to encourage people to do that. And at this moment, there's so much talk about the bike boom and the COVID bike boom and what it means for the future. I'll certainly be very interested to see those numbers in a year from now, and major fingers crossed we see that kind of boom extend to the new normal for real. So thank you very much for your presentation today. And it transitions really nicely into our next presentation by David Vitale. David is the Data Services Specialist at EcoCounter. In much more normal times, Dave and I would be sitting side by side in our EcoCounter office, but instead we're in our respective homes in our kitchens. David's going to talk about something that I'm personally really excited about, something we've been working on together for the past 6 months. And I won't spoil it. I'll pass it over to you, David. Go ahead.
Thank you, Matt. It is a pleasure to be here today talking alongside Katie, Matt, and Braden. So it's a great opportunity. I will be discussing American bike trends and some global bike trends here in 2020. And yeah, it does extend nicely from Katie's presentation in terms of looking at how cycling has changed a little bit this year. So we created a cycling trends dashboard, something Matt was quite involved in. The reason was, well, manyfold. We did have a lot of clients asking us if their changes in bike counts were being seen elsewhere. And we are in a unique position to be sharing publicly some aggregated data. We have counters in more than 50 countries. I believe there's more than 18,000 counters deployed in these 50 countries. And so we could be giving, not just to our clients, but the public at large, a bit of a snapshot of what these dynamic times have meant for cycling across countries and regions. So on our dashboard, we're showing data. It's updated now by month. At the beginning of the pandemic, it was being updated by week because things were so dynamic. But we're sharing about 300 counting sites in Europe and 110 counting sites in North America, of which 90 are from the States. These counters are for the most part urban, in or near urban centers. They're distributed really across each country. So in the States, we divided it up into 6 regions. They're kind of nicely distributed across the States. About half of the counting sites represent protected on-street bikeway counts, and the other half on trails. So either on in large park trail systems or along rail corridors connecting different parts of urban centers. So we tried to make these counting sites as representative as possible. So looking a little bit at how September fared this year compared to last, just about every country that we're studying saw growth overall in cycling. The United States is somewhere in the middle with about a 10% growth this year compared to last September, aggregating all these counters together. Italy is in top place with a 28% increase over last September. If we take a look at weekday and weekend separately, we can see very different comparisons to last year. Weekend counts have just skyrocketed, up over 30%, whereas weekday counts in the States are marginally higher than last year, 3% more than September 2019. I should note that just being on par with last year's numbers, given how much transportation demand has decreased for all modes in general, is itself quite incredible. You know, just maintaining last year's numbers would be impressive, but in fact, there's a modest increase during weekdays as well. If we take a look at different regions in North America and compare it again to this month or last month in 2019, we can see that not all regions have had the same growth. And this has been quite dynamic over 2020 as the pandemic has kind of affected different regions differently over the months. But in September, the Southwest in the States, Western Canada, and the United States in the Northeast saw large increases compared to last year. And again, you can see that for my apologies here. Yeah, all weekends had all regions had a major increase on weekends. Some had an increase compared to last year during weekdays, whereas others less so. What we're looking at in this slide is the evolution week after week for all counters in the United States this year compared to last. So these are percent changes on the y-axis. And I'll draw your attention to the fact that there are no negative values. So every single week this year, there has been an increase of cycling compared to last year, which is really quite remarkable. It started with a very warm spring, early spring in February and early March, where cycling was up 50–60% relative to last year. Even during the peak of the first wave during confinement in many urban centers, there was considerably more cycling compared to last year, about 5 to 15%. Then we had that summer explosion of cycling where a lot of people were out in May and June. Cycling numbers were about 30 to 40% above last year. And since then, there's been this sustained increase in cycling between about 5 and 20% through the late summer and this fall. If we take a look globally at all of the countries that we've studied, they all tell a pretty similar story. Again, at warm spring, saw a lot of cycling compared to the previous year in just about all countries. Some countries that were affected more in the first wave of the pandemic, such as Italy and Spain, had more severe travel restrictions and lockdowns. Cycling plummeted down to 10 to 20% of what would be typical that time of year. But in just about all countries, there was a rebound afterwards, and cycling has been considerably up over the summer and in the fall. It's worth noting that these changes are not static. They're very dynamic. They've changed over the course of the year. If we take, for example, a host of counters in the American Northeast, and we look on the left at what the typical weekday in blue and weekend in red looked like this spring out in March and in April and early May, the weekend counts were quite high relative to weekday counts. There was essentially no discernible commuting pattern. The two peaks that we typically see in commuting patterns didn't really exist. People were not really going to work at all, so we didn't see that profile. But those same counters this fall has seen considerably more commuting than in the spring or even in the summer. And so those commuting trends are coming back. People are biking to school, biking to work, biking for any number of reasons, the same reasons that they would have pre-pandemic. I think it's worth noting that all of these global trends are, really a summation of actions that are taken at the local level. Actions that we've already heard Braden and Katie speak of. So, what we're seeing here is just really the summation of improved and widened bike facilities on some major cycling corridors. Streets that have become pedestrianized, that it's very attractive for cyclists as well. In addition to commercial streets, some roads have been made into permanent or temporary ciclovias that attracts people in spandex and also people not in spandex. And lastly, some of these measures have turned into more permanent installations, whether they're wider or just permanent cycle tracks. This has kind of been the trend. It's been a year where these sorts of activities have been really catalyzed for a lot of different communities all across North America. These photos were taken in Montreal. They probably could have been taken in just about any city across Canada or the United States. So just a few observations. This bike boom in 2020 has been felt in many countries, just about all countries we studied. Cycling in the United States has increased significantly this year. There was a moderate increase in weekday traffic, which, from my perspective, seeing the reduction in use in private vehicle use and transit, it just shows how robust and resilient cycling is as a mode. Just to have maintained last year's levels during weekday traffic. There's also been a very high increase in weekend traffic, which we associate a lot with recreational use, but isn't necessarily solely that. The response to COVID and changes in weather will continue to affect different regions of the United States and the world differently over time. So this is not a static thing, but really a very dynamic thing where we'll see, huge spikes in cycling for some regions over some periods, and then maybe, back to what we would have seen in previous years. And I guess I'll just leave you with a question. Do you think that this cycling boom will become a new baseline in your community? And that's kind of an open question for folks to ponder. And I guess the follow-up would just be, are you in a position to measure what those changes might be this year and in the coming years? So that's it for my presentation. Thank you all so much for your time.
Thank you very much, David. Thanks for sharing the dashboard. And we can talk a lot about the boom, we talk about the year-on-year growth, but something that you and I have talked a lot about in the past 6 months or so is sort of like digging into that boom, digging into the granular level. And it's super interesting to see how even like the hourly profile has changed. You and I have talked about that a lot, about weekdays switch away from these like traditional peaks at commuting times to see the counts more spread out throughout the day as people perhaps run an errand by bicycle or just want to get out of the house, work from home and want to bike around or to work out or something like that. It's really interesting to dig into that granular level. So
absolutely.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing your perspective. And just for everyone listening, you can check out our dashboard. It's on the EcoCanada website. If you go to ecocanada.com, there's a little link in the top banner, and it's fully interactive. You can explore the change in bike counts year over year and play a little bit with the data to track the boom. It's nice to look at, and it's a lot of fun. And so with that, I will move on to our next presenter, who is Matt Starkey. Matt is a transportation engineer at Presidio Trust in San Francisco, and I will pass it over to you, Matt. Thanks very much.
Great. Thank you, fellow Matt. Hi, everyone. Oops. My name is Matt Starkey, and I am excited to talk to you about what to do with your ped and bike data. As an engineer, this is what I spend a lot of my time thinking about. How do we allocate our space and our infrastructure to support biking and pedestrian facilities? And I'm going to talk a little bit how to do that. So what I want you to take from this is how to identify sources of data. And we've talked about that a lot already. I think you got some great examples from the previous presenters. And I'm going to show you how to distill that data into useful pieces that we can analyze. I'll share a few resources that you can go to find analysis procedures. And I'll give you a few examples that I've been doing as part of our responses to COVID-19, as a lot of agencies have been doing as well. And I'll first start off with just a little bit about the Presidio, because it's a really fascinating place. The Presidio is located in the northwest corner of San Francisco. We're right at the base of the Golden Gate Bridge. You've probably been here if you've come to take a selfie on the bridge or something. The park is managed by the Presidio Trust, which is the federal agency that I work for. And we have 7,000 people that work or live in the park, and we have about 10 million annual visitors. Within the park, there's 30 miles of roads, 25 miles of bikeways, 24 miles of trails. And then all those trails, roads, and bikeways, we have plenty of counters to collect data. Here's some examples here that Braden's already talked about. Permanent and temporary count locations, we have those in the park. We also count our roadways to collect vehicle data with our eco counters. Keep in mind for our infrastructure decisions, we sometimes need to know how wide things are, what sort of facilities exist. So you might need some other data besides volume information, like something from GIS or maybe other online maps. And then there's also a lot of other cooperating agencies out there that have a lot of really insightful data. For example, transit agencies will have ridership data, or they may even have travel times on roadway that might be helpful for your projects. Even just recently, I collaborated with our emergency services department so that we could do a little bit of video collection on one of our roadways to observe some changes that we're about to make there. I think you can always find people who, especially in transportation, there's always a lot of overlap with other places that might have useful data for you. I think what we've heard is really the major piece of information that's helpful is really volumes. How many cars, how many bikes, how many peds. So I want to talk a little bit more about what to do with your volume data once you have it. So there's three pieces of volume data that we use very frequently in engineering work. A peak 15-minute volume, a peak hour volume, and daily volumes. Peak hour and daily are really the most common and probably the easiest for you to collect. These are things that your permanent count stations may have for you. The peak hour you can see in this chart is just what it sounds like, the heaviest usage there. You might use that data in your analysis to, under your most intense usage of your facility, how is it performing? And your peak hour is going to help you inform that. If you wanted to take it another level, you could use that peak 15 minutes period. I want to be an engineer, but then share some equations with you. I think one thing to remember, there's all these data sources that you have, but sometimes you need something slightly different to do your analysis. So you can convert between all these pretty easily with peak hour factors or K factors. These will convert your daily, peak, and 15-minute volumes. And these can come right from your eco counters. If you have a permanent count station, those are great sources to get this sort of information from. So while volumes do change throughout the day, it's also important to remember that they're going to change throughout the month and from year to year. So what those are called seasonal adjustments and annual adjustments. You can see in the chart how from January to December, the bike volumes on one of our trails change. More use in the summer, less use in the winter. That's a pretty common pattern for all sorts of transportation facilities. So for example, if you maybe had a temporary count location somewhere and you counted in February and you wanted to understand what the peak usage actually would be, well, on my chart, I can see that August is actually the peak month for this facility. So I need to convert my February volumes to August volumes to understand what the peak usage is. Similarly, if you're looking for trends from year to year, we can actually see from this chart that it looks like 2018 had slightly higher volumes than 2019. So we may want to make some adjustment to find a more reliable average for those years. So you can use seasonal adjustment and annual adjustment to create a kind of average that you can compare. You can create this similar comparison between different types of data that you've collected. So then with your data, you've found your good volume data, maybe you have some speed data, you already know what your facilities are like. How are you going to analyze all that? How are you going to make some decisions based on that data that you have? So I think there's three factors that really inform the type of either data you want to collect or the analysis you'll be able to do based on the data you have. The one we've talked a lot about is your bike and ped volumes or speeds. Another one, if you have on-road bike facilities, are the car volumes and speeds. And then kind of for both of those situations, you might want to know a little bit about your facility. You know, how wide is the bike path? Is there a shoulder? If I have a separated bike lane, how big is the buffer? And some of these guides here, I think are really, really useful. Bikeway selection guide by FHWA, the highway capacity manual. These all have some easy charts for you to pull information from quickly, and also have some analysis procedures to do to actually evaluate your facility to see if it's performing in the way that you'd like. And so I'm going to show you a few examples of those. The first one I want to show you is this example from early on in the pandemic. We were really concerned about our trail usage. I think, like the other presenters have mentioned, a lot more people were out riding their bike or walking, and that was no exception for us in the Presidio. So I'm going to talk about how you can evaluate your trails to see if you have enough space on them, and also show you some of the analysis we're doing as part of our Slow Street program. So the first one is walkway and trail evaluation. So the data you'll need for this is your walkway width. You go measure that in the field. And pedestrian volumes, something that could come from some sort of count. And then the analysis that you could do with this is in the highway capacity manual, there's a methodology for pedestrian level of service. And that basically is kind of a function of how much square footage there is per person. And that sort of square footage per person is something that has been on my mind a lot with COVID-19 because of the social distancing. We're all asked to stay 6 feet apart from everybody, and that really changes the amount of space you need on your trails, on your sidewalks. You know, level of service A pre-COVID, walking down the sidewalk was 60 square feet per person. But now they have to keep 6 feet away from everybody. With your bubble, you know, you're looking more like 160 square feet per person. That's a really big increase in space if you want to stay socially distanced. So that got me thinking about, like, well, how are, you know, roadways and trails supporting that sort of social distance that we're asked to have now? So here's an example from the methodology. This is the really classic example, then I'll show you how we did it in the park. We have a sidewalk that has a really active furnishing zone or has big windows. You have a sidewalk width shown in blue there, but is that really the amount of width that you have for walking? And the answer is no, because you have all these obstructions in the way. So part of this methodology actually reduces your sidewalk width into an effective width based on the number of obstructions you have. So here's a few examples. So if you have a large window display, maybe people are stopping to look in the window, and that would kind of reduce the amount of space you have to walk by them. You know, we've seen this a lot during the pandemic, is really opening up parklets and sidewalks for people to dine outside in, which is great for businesses, but maybe not so great for your sidewalk width. You can see here that, you know, that's taking up a lot of space there for people to be walking. And so that effective width that you have to actually travel down the sidewalk is reduced substantially. In this picture, seeing it and kind of being out in these situations, just personally during the pandemic, is a little stressful because you just see how many people are so close together. So let's take a little breath of fresh air and look back at the park. So this walkway methodology could still apply perhaps to a trail. And this is one of our trails in the Presidio. So taking that similar sort of what is our effective width question, here we have a short retaining wall and a fence line. And so those two factors actually reduce the amount of width because people are going to shy away from them when they're walking. So to understand effective width, we can combine a few other pieces of data to really understand how much space there is per person. That's what we're looking for. So we have our effective width. From our count station, we can understand our peak volume, and this is a peak hour volume. You could also take a peak 15-minute volume and adjust that with the peak hour factor. So you could really look at the peak conditions that you have. With this analysis, you'll need a speed that you can assume. I assumed this speed of 3.5 feet per second. It's common in the NVTCD for signal analysis. In this methodology, the speed is typically a little higher, closer to 4 feet per second. I adjusted that because people are hiking, you know, we're not in a rush to get to work. We're Californians, we're being chill, we're just walking around in the woods. So I think a little slower speed represents our conditions, but is also a little bit more conservative for this analysis. So I went through that methodology and I found out that we had about 234 square feet per person, which was okay, but then, you know, remembered what the COVID space was of 160 square feet, and just having a little bit of a factor of safety there against some unknown virus maybe didn't make me feel so good. So I think that information is actually, you know, really helpful just to kind of quantify what the situations are out there for you, and helps you. For us, we were able to quickly kind of rank, you know, where in the park do we have trails that are getting this really high usage? Because maybe you have a really wide trail that sees a 200% increase in traffic, but you may not actually, you know, you may not be limited in space there. So this could really help you, you know, prioritize your trail network by understanding where more usage is happening and where it's actually impacting the amount of space people have. And I think that sort of thought process is, hey, we need more space for people to bike and walk now, is really represented well by the slow street movement that we've seen throughout the world. And for us, we decided to create a few streets in the park where we limited the through traffic to really emphasize them for biking and walking for our residents and tenants in the park, but also the neighbors that live in the city. So to analyze these conditions, it's a really new type of facility, so there's no highway capacity manual methodology for it. So I was going to rely more on some design guides for similar facilities. So I was taking the vehicular volumes and speeds on the roadway and applying that to similar facilities to see what the results are like. So we used a portable radar counter, which you can see in the bottom left of this screen, to collect speeds and volumes on Washington Boulevard, one of our slow streets. We can see this trend from back in July when we installed the counter, kind of speeds and volumes slowly increasing throughout the time as people got more comfortable with the facility. I think one just quick note, what's really cool about having these long periods of time is you can see when something unique happens. For us, that was when the sky turned orange back in September. You can see volumes went down a lot. Everyone stayed inside that day. But back on our slow street, right now we're seeing volume speeds around 28 miles per hour. That's the 85th percentile speed. And we're also seeing average daily traffic of about 1,300 cars per day. So looking at information, I kind of want to understand, well, how does that fit into similar facilities? Are those volumes and speeds okay for a slow street? Do we need to do anything about it? So those are the questions you can start to answer when you compare it to some guidance that's out there. The first guide that I looked at was the FHWA Bikeway Selection Guide. And that has a really great chart, vehicle volume, vehicle speed, and kind of mapped with the amount of stress that cyclists feel in those conditions. And so looking at our volumes and speed, we're kind of in this transitionary zone between shared bike lanes or bike boulevards being comfortable and needing a little bit more defined space like a bike lane. So that makes me think a little bit about, well, maybe we need to consider some change out here. Similarly, I looked at another guide that I thought was similar to this situation, which is a treatment called an advisory shoulder, also called advisory bike lanes. And that's a condition where the center line is removed from the roadway and you create kind of a dashed shoulder or bike lane that indicates the space is more shared for vehicles and people using that lane. So under these conditions from the guide, we're kind of we've stepped just out the sort of preferred speed and volume threshold, and we're kind of in that potential area. While the volumes are really low on the roadway, the speed's a little bit higher than we want. So I think for us, that means it's something we need to keep monitoring, and I think we're going to start to consider how to add a little bit more traffic calming on our roads. Being a park, we don't really have a consistent blocks every 600 feet like you might have in the city. We have longer stretches of road so people can pick up speed a little bit differently than in a typical urban situation. So those are some examples of how you can use the analysis. We learned about where you can source your data from your count stations. I showed you how you can manipulate that data so you have something good quality information to feed into your analysis, and then a few simple analysis procedures that you can do to evaluate the quality of your space that you're providing. And here's my contact information if you have any questions, and thanks for your attention.
Thanks very much for your presentation, Matt. It's really great to hear your perspective. We hear more and more the questions about integrating counts with safety and the questions about slow streets and safety. So it's really interesting to hear how you're sort of taking those FHWA methodologies and using count data to really do on the ground changes to streets and study streets using counts and speed data for that. And I think maybe you put up some FHWA resources on the slide. Maybe we'll grab those and share them with the recording or something like that, so the attendees have those and can easily access. Great. Thanks very much, Matt. And lastly, I will pass it over to Amelia. Amelia, I know you had a couple of connection issues earlier on. I think you're still with us now, and if so, I'll hand it over to you to talk a little bit about the league and what's going on with you guys right now. I think you have a slight delay or poor connection, Amelia. It's the joys of everyone working from home and the challenges we face. Too many people are, it's telling me that too many people are unmuted. So I'd encourage our attendees to please mute yourself and free up Amelia's ability to speak.
Okay. All right, I think that worked. Sorry, I've never seen that message before from GoToWebinar, but thanks for your patience, and thanks for everyone's patience through the technical glitches today. So thanks again to all the speakers and EcoCounter for this really awesome presentations. I just wanted to make a couple comments. Matt did a good job already of talking about how the bicycle-friendly community program fits in with data collection, and I think it goes without saying that communities with more data collection are at the higher award levels. We in the BFC review process really want to see that communities are making the effort to track their ridership, track their safety outcomes, track the progress, so measure, count, all of that. Matt referenced this infographic that we did with them in 2018, surveying BFCs on what kind of data collection practices they had. And then it's not surprising to also see that bike commuting itself is much higher in bicycle-friendly communities to other non-BFCs. But having that data is really critical to making the case for building bicycle-friendly communities. One other quick plug I wanted to make is you might already be familiar with the benchmarking report for bicycling and walking. This is something the League took over from our sister organization, the Alliance for Biking and Walking, several years ago. It's a CDC-funded program initiative to under their Active People, Healthy Nation initiative. This is a report on data and metrics benchmarking over the years around biking and walking. It's been a physical printed report for many years, and this year, with support from the CDC, we were able to make an interactive online website for it. So I just wanted to quickly plug this so that folks know it exists. It's brand new, it just came out earlier this month. But on this website, you will find 140 different data tables and graphs, and each one of them has accompanying data that you can download. If you see this, it's just a screenshot from the website, but it's a combination of various federal data sources, looking at the entire country, looking at all 50 states, and then looking at the 50 largest cities in the country. So just as an example of some demographic data we saw of biking and walking rates over time. We look at safety in the cities, the 50 largest cities, comparing ridership to fatalities. These are just some very quick examples, but you can go in and explore. Like I said, there are 140 different tables and graphs to explore, and then you can download the data to do your own analysis if you'd like. Here's another example looking at reported bike and ped infrastructure of large cities and training and events for bicyclists and pedestrians for smaller mid-sized cities. So you can go in and see some of this data is things we have collected from bicycle-friendly community and bicycle-friendly state applications over the years, and some are publicly available data sets that are available nationwide. And as new data becomes available, especially at that federal level, we will be updating this. So right now, this website has the 2018 benchmarking reports data, but it will be updated in the future. And then speaking of the future, I also wanted to make a quick plug for the National have really great bike data related sessions during the summit over the last few years in partnership with EcoCounter. So we're looking forward to hopefully being able to provide that again this year. If you in the audience have a great story to share from your community about bike data collection or any topic related to biking, our RFP is currently open and the deadline is November 15th. So go to bikeleague.org/summit. And so with that, I am going to open it up for questions. I'll stop sharing my screen and ask all of the other attendees to, all the other speakers to join me with their cameras on. And we did get some questions.
Amelia, you cut out again.
Several people came in with questions about whether the counters can see scooters and recognize the difference between scooters and bikes. So that's sort of open to anyone, but if anybody has experience specifically with scooters and other micromobility, there were several questions about that.
I can speak from the perspective of EcoCounter in that at the moment our counters don't reliably count e-scooters. We've done major testing on that, and it picks them up a lot of the time, doesn't pick them up some of the time. But we are coming out with a new counter, a new version of our Zelt counter that is like the permanent bike counter, coming out with that early next year, that will be able to count and classify e-scooters as well as multiple types of bike categories such as cargo bikes, for example, as well. So we've received this question a lot and have been working on it. So coming soon.
Great, thanks. And we got a similar question about e-bikes, and I'm wondering if anybody, if any counters can tell the difference between an acoustic bike, as I like to call them, and an e-bike. Yeah, I'll let you all answer that if there is any way to track that with automated counters.
I can say that presently eco-counters aren't able to distinguish between e-bikes and regular acoustic bikes. However, in the future, the ability to measure speed will be a possibility. And so really seeing what that difference is between your 75th percentile speed and 25th percentile speed may be an opportunity for engineers and planners to get a better understanding of safety on bike facilities. So that's something that will exist in coming months and years.
Right. Going back to Braden in our first presentation, you talked a little bit about portable counters. And you mentioned that they were less robust, and a couple people wanted more information about that, and if they can be used for multiple modes, and just any other thoughts on sort of portable counters. And if others have experience, feel free to jump in there too.
Yeah, sure. So I guess what I meant in terms of robustness, the volumes or the data that you're getting regarding traffic volume is only going to exist for how long you have the counter deployed for. So if it's out for 2 weeks, you get 2 weeks worth of data, where by contrast, a permanent counter is constantly generating that data for you. Depending on the portable counter that you're using, speaking at least in terms of EcoCounter, there are portable options where you can use a couple counters simultaneously and still gather that same data of differentiation between cyclists and pedestrians and directional travel. But again, that robustness difference will be in the length of time that that counter is installed. There are also different portable counters that we use. Trafex is one of them, JMR is one of them, that do similar things, but yeah, in that case, I think the characteristics that you're measuring would be different.
Yeah, I'd add on top of what Braden said. I agree with what you said earlier, where you need to know your tools, know your counters. I don't see it as a choice between portable or permanent. I kind of see them as a different tool for different things. The permanent counters, I talked a little bit about how you might want to understand how seasonality changes your volumes out there. You can't do that with a portable counter because it's not meant to be out there for all seasons. So if you really want to start tracking long-term trends, you're going to need a permanent count station. You want to track short changes, like the bridge going out example you gave was a really good one. Hey, maybe you need to go put up some temporary counters somewhere so you can see where things change. So yeah, I think it's a choice for what type of data you need is going to inform the type of counter you install.
If I may just add, those are great points. We can help our clients use short-term counts and extrapolate them to get average annual counts or seasonal or even monthly averages. So if you did a before and after count, the before count was done in April and the after in September, you can essentially take into account the different months in which those counts were done using the data from your permanent counters. That's something we can help tool you up with or provide that to you as a service.
Great. And then we've, not surprisingly, gotten a couple questions about funding and costs. And one question in particular came in for Katie. How did Arlington fund 36 permanent counters? And how did it sort of end up falling under Department of Environmental Services? And then a follow-up question for Katie and everyone is, have you found using bike data for making the case to increase funding? Do you have any examples of being able to make the case using that data for general bike infrastructure funding?
Yeah, I'll speak to the Department of Environmental Services first. It's an interesting name for a department that also includes our Department of Transportation. So they do public works as well. So that's why it falls under DES. Our group falls under DES as well, because it's all about helping commuters and things like that. The counters have gone in over a period of over a decade. So it's, you know, from what I understand, it's actually just capital funding. I'm sure some of it was grant related, but I can look more into that and send out some information about it. And what was the other half of the question that you had?
Using bike data to make the case for increasing funding for bike infrastructure or programming. And that could be a question for anybody if anyone has thoughts on that.
Yeah, I personally don't have a bunch of hands-on experience with grant writing and grant applications, but there is somebody who works in our office who focuses specifically on that. And she says that having that bike and ped data when pursuing either grants for particular pedestrian or cyclist related projects is super handy. And I would assume that if you can use a tool like that to get other projects done, then the usefulness of your counters is going to increase, and then you know, the your stock starts to go up for going after more counters.
I can second that as well.
Great, thanks. So we got a safety related question. Are usage counts being used to learn crash frequency? Counts as a reliable denominator under number of injury crashes over time or after facility improvements? Has anyone used these general ridership data to sort of correlate to safety data?
Yeah, I could talk about that a little bit. This question's spot on. Yeah, you need to have good ridership information to understand your crash, to understand really how crash patterns are changing over time. So that's another piece of data that you need to get your hands on is maybe if you're looking at bike and ped crashes, and your DOT may have that. In our example, we work with the park police to get those sort of crash reports. And I think it's one thing that we've seen all around the country is, you know, bike crashes have gone up over time because more people are riding their bike. And so you often see bike volumes increasing more than crashes. So your crash rate is actually coming down. So I think that that is actually a really important piece of data for people to show, and these permanent count stations are a great way to identify that trend of biking increasing over time, and then to compare that with how many crashes you're getting.
I could add, we did a study with a couple of our clients. We took some eco counter permanent counts. We extrapolated some short-term counts to get about 2 dozen locations with average annual daily bicyclists. And then with about 6,000 to 8,000 traces using a dedicated GPS app, we were able to extrapolate average annual daily bicyclists across an entire city network. Once we had that, we used crash data over a 10-year period. So we essentially generated some of the hotspot intersections in the city, and that was really a first step towards of the process of prioritizing intersections for in-depth engineering analysis for safety improvement. It's a big job, but it really can help in the process of identifying locations to prioritize in your network.
Thank you. Another question for EcoCounter. Do you guys have any idea of the percentage of counters installed on bike lanes versus shared roads versus cycle tracks, different facility types in general? Metadata, if you will, where your counters are being used?
That's a great question. I don't have the exact number in mind. David, maybe you do. But
I'm writing down the question. It's
yeah,
a great
exactly.
one.
It's something we can very easily figure out. Immediately comes to mind that it's fairly evenly split, but yeah, that's something we'd have to think about, and maybe we can get your contact information through the chat and get back to you about that one. I'd be very curious to know myself, actually.
Great. And then a couple more questions came in about the permanent versus portable counters. What's the typical service life for permanent counters, and what's the downside of leaving a portable counter out all year?
Yeah, so permanent counters can go on the ground and be there for many, many, many years. Like, you need to think, as I think it was Braden mentioned, you need to think about the battery. You don't want to lose some data because your battery has run out, for example. But in terms of the loops going in the ground, they can go in for many, many, many years. I think we have Zelts in the ground, permanent bike counters in the ground that have been there something like over a decade now. But that has to be done with sort of coordination with different city departments. You know, if the road has been ripped up for whatever reason, maybe the pipes have been done on the ground, you need to coordinate with that department, otherwise it gets ripped up. Next thing you know, you have a gap in your data, and you're like, oh, okay, it's gone. So definitely it requires coordination, and definitely requires communication to keep it in the ground that long. But if it's in there, it'll keep on counting, and you'll get that data year on year. Portable counters, the one that you have to think about most in terms of the duration is the tube counter. So that's the 2 little back strips that you put across the road. If you're doing it in mixed traffic with vehicles and bicycles and counting just the bicycles, you need to think about changing those tubes every now and again, because the vehicle traffic, especially in high volume areas, will sort of like really put those tubes through a lot. And again, also a bit of coordination. Some pretty horrible stories about like the street sweepers that just pick them up. That's not so fun. And also the snowplows too, in areas where you have snow on the ground, but you're still counting, they'll rip up those tubes. So the answer is that they're all durable and they'll all last a long time, but requires a bit of maintenance, a bit of work, a bit of communication with other departments. But I'd certainly be curious to hear what some of our other panelists have to say about that too.
I liked watching Braden's reaction to when you're saying it seems like he's been through a lot of those situations. I know that I have myself. Street sweepers are the enemies of tube counters. So if you have a great street sweeping program in your community, you're really gonna have to coordinate on that. I've lost a lot of data myself because of that. And I think that's kind of one of the decisions behind portable versus permanent. Is portable is, you know, meant for that quick win on getting some data, and it's going to require a lot more maintenance from you versus having some strategically placed permanent counters that you can rely on with limited maintenance, just changing the batteries, you know, every once in a while. That's how we do things in the Presidio. We have, you know, counters on our trails, in our roads, on separated bike facilities. So that works well for us in such a small area to get good, reliable data with minimal effort on our part.
Great. Well, we are at time for our 90-minute webinar, and there are more questions, but we'll try to get back to some of you folks by email. So keep an eye out for a message from me or from the folks at EcoCounter. Again, I really want to thank all the attendees for joining us for the last 90 minutes and all of our speakers. Thank you all so much for sharing your wisdom and experience and expertise with us today. A huge thank you to EcoCounter for helping pull this webinar together and for all your support of the Bicycle Friendly Community Program. If folks have any questions, feel free to reach out to any of the speakers today or to myself. We're always available at bfa@bikeleague.org if you have questions. And I'm sure the folks at EcoCounter feel the same way. Feel free to reach out with any follow-up questions. The webinar is being recorded. You'll get an email with the recording tomorrow, along with a PDF of all the slides. So keep an eye out for that as well, and stay tuned for our next Bike Data webinar. Look forward to bringing more content to you all again soon. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.